What's up, guys? Welcome back to part 1, or not welcome back. Welcome to part 1 if Deku had a projection quirk. So this is like my 6th time trying to record this. My software has been bugging out over the past couple days. So if this goes up, it worked! So I'm gonna shout out the same people again. So thank you, Iffy, Infinite What If, Folger, Unbelievable is a bot. My bad. Crow, Taco John, and Magic MJT. Thank you all for joining. If you want to get shout out in the next video, go ahead and join. So first off, I'm going to explain what this projection quirk is. The projection quirk is a quirk that allows the user to project weapons. It also, when heavily used to a higher extent, can allow the user to project a reality of his choosing. That is the projection quirk's ability. Any weapons the user projects will retain their abilities they have. So, for example, if Izuku were to project the gun, he would create a gun with unlimited ammo, because that is something the weapon is known for having. It's known for having ammunition. Or if Izuku were to project, let's say, a magical sword, it would be able to use its magical properties. But Izuku needs to have an understanding of the weapon he wishes to project. He can't just project a nameless weapon that doesn't have any understanding of. So it limits itself in that category. And Izuku can only use the reality projection once a week, limiting him greatly. But now that you understand the basics of the quirk and how it overall works, let's jump straight into what if. We open up on Izuku. He's about around 4 years old at the current time period, and is very young. He was taken to the quirk doctor. He still hadn't awoken his quirk, but the quirk doctor said that he did have a quirk. They didn't know what the quirk was, but they noticed he had the bone that signifies that he should have a quirk. The doctor didn't know what was going on with Izuku's quirk and why it hadn't manifested, but he figured maybe he might be one of those rare late bloomer cases. And figured that if that was the case, then Izuku's quirk, well, could be a plethora of things, multiple of which that he didn't know of currently. So he decided to leave Izuku alone, opting out of actually trying to take Izuku's quirk. Eventually, though, Izuku was playing outside with Bakugo. Bakugo knew Izuku had a quirk, but hadn't unlocked it yet, or hadn't awakened, which really didn't upset Bakugo because he didn't really think of himself as higher than Izuku at that point. Reminding you that the only reason why Bakugo acted the way he did was because he perceived himself to be higher than most other people because of his amazing quirk. But knowing that Izuku just hasn't unlocked his yet, caused a rather different experience in Bakugo's mindset, causing him to realize that Izuku's quirk very well might be really strong. So Bakugo decided against bullying or teasing or making any manner of rude comments towards Izuku. Eventually, the days go by and Izuku still hasn't collected his quirk. And then the months. And then the years. Eventually, Izuku watches a movie. This movie was very simple. It was based off the tale of King Arthur, which Izuku liked. He liked the heroic knight. Bakugo thought he was too cheesy for his taste, so didn't like Arthur nearly as much as Izuku did. Eventually, over time, Bakugo and Izuku slowly parted ways, and on the way home, Izuku was walking through an alley. While walking through an alley, he ended up running into a robber who was trying to mug Izuku of all of his cash and belongings. Izuku, still lamenting that he was still relatively weak, almost cried out, wanting to be able to do something, anything to change the situation. Then he remembered King Arthur in the movie, and remembered his sword Excalibur. Izuku wished he had his sword Excalibur, and when the robber almost shot Izuku, Izuku raised up his hand in defense, only to see a bright flash of light. This confused Izuku greatly, but confused the robber even more, who thought Izuku had used his quirk, and thinking that Izuku was some super strong guy. Not too many quirks allowed bright flashes or something like the case to happen, so for this kid just to randomly activated it, threw off the guy. But what threw him off even more is when he saw a weapon manifested in Izuku's hands. A sword. This sword was a glistening blade that was long. It was only one-handed, which confused Izuku slightly, but he looked at the blade while it was in his hand. The robber was still extremely confused about the situation. Izuku, realizing that this sword paid very similar image to Excalibur. Of course, King Arthur's sword. So Izuku, looking back at the man, pointed the sword at him. The man almost laughed at this point. Having a gun pointed at Izuku and getting a sword pointed back at him? That's hilarious. This caused Izuku to sigh, and then he remembered one unique thing inside the movie. That King Arthur's sword, when he said Excalibur, released a beam of holy light. Izuku decided to test his luck, and maybe the stars were aligned, because when he said Excalibur, the sword reacted and shone very bright, as suddenly the man was blown back. But after that happened, the sword that Izuku held in his hand had broken and vanished. This confused Izuku. Lamenting and not understanding what just happened, he quickly ran home. After making it home, he called up Bakugo. Bakugo and Izuku were still somewhat decently friends, and he told Bakugo that he think he had just unlocked his quirk. This confused Bakugo, and he asked what happened. Izuku explained that he almost got robbed, which Bakugo almost freaked out about, of course, for a plethora of reasons. Izuku was his friend, and for someone wanting to inspire to be the number one hero, allowing their friend to almost get robbed isn't a good way to start out. But eventually, Izuku went into details on how he was wishing he had the sword Excalibur in his hands, and just like that, the sword had appeared. This confused Bakugo very greatly, actually. He didn't know what to make of Izuku's quirk, because if, well, what Izuku said was true, seeing how Izuku had no reason to lie, that would mean Izuku seemed to have the ability to manifest a holy sword. This confused Bakugo even more, as he eventually told Izuku to meet up with him the next morning. Izuku and Bakugo met up in the middle of the forest. School had let out a little while ago, and Bakugo usually tend to train in the mornings, preparing to go to UA. He also knew that Izuku was also training, but seeing how Izuku never had a quirk, or hadn't unlocked his quirk, Bakugo was very hesitant about keeping Izuku around him while they were training. He knew Izuku was pretty tough, but he also knew he was quirkless, so without a quirk, it would be quite difficult for Izuku to even stand a chance against him. So Bakugo knew not to actually activate his quirk around Izuku. Eventually, Bakugo asked Izuku to do what he did previously, which Izuku obliged. He thought of the sword Excalibur, having a very vivid image of it in his head. And just like that, a blast of flashlight, bright light, tongue twister shown, confusing both Bakugo and Izuku once again as Excalibur appeared in his hands. Bakugo was awestruck by this because the sword was a pretty beautiful sword. He may not be a blacksmith, but anyone can admire the guts of a sword. Bakugo was impressed, and then he asked Izuku to test it out on the tree, which Izuku did. He swung at the tree, but after a hit, it immediately shattered. This caused a confusing look from Izuku, as well as from Bakugo. Bakugo asked Izuku if this was only his second time using it, which Izuku said yes. So Bakugo deduced that most likely what was happening wasn't anything more than him just not knowing how to actively use it. This made a lot of sense to Izuku, because not only does it equivalent to him not being able to use it, but it also means that what he was attempting was basically using it something not as good. Over time, Bakugo then asked Izuku to try to copy or manifest different swords, all with varying levels of degree of success. When he asked Izuku to manifest a katana, Izuku was able to manifest it and swing it around without it really breaking. The only time it broke was when Bakugo used one of his explosions on it, and even then he had to put quite a force behind his explosion to utterly blow up Izuku's katana, kind of saddening Izuku. But Bakugo started to get a gist of Izuku's quirk, and Izuku also started to get a gist of his own quirk too. They both end up coming to the assumption that Izuku's quirk worked pretty impressively, to say the least. It worked by using Izuku's abilities, and as long as he can accurately project the item in question, he would have the capability to summon it. This goes from just seeing it to know the abilities and the materials it was forged out of. So while, yes, he can summon Excalibur, Excalibur was a one-time use item. He had only seen it, and really didn't know much of it. This eventually caused Bakugo and Izuku, after coming to the assumption, to force Izuku to train on not his quirk, but weapons surrounding his quirk. Izuku had only tested making swords, seeing how there was no point on testing anything else, at least in his book. So then Izuku decided to test the dragon-slaying sword Graham, and it worked. Izuku didn't know too much, but he knew more about this sword and could use it pretty actively, understanding the basic makeup of the sword and the materials that were used in it. Over the months, Izuku ended up training using his quirk. He also decided to take up Kendo to learn a form of sword fighting. Obviously, this wasn't going to work with all his different types of weaponry, but it should still work to a decent degree, at least in Izuku's mindset. Eventually, as the months came to a close, Izuku and Bakugo both took the entrance test to UA, as they both prepared after taking the written test, which Bakugo and Izuku both found to be pretty simple. Izuku then decided to talk with Bakugo, and Bakugo and Izuku both said that if either one of them got first place, the other one had to go buy the one that got first place lunch for an entire week. Now that the bets were set, Izuku smiled gallantly as he prepared to take the entrance exam. And that's where I'm going to leave this one off, guys. If you liked it, hit the like button. If you enjoyed it, hit the subscribe button. And I'm sorry that uploads have been stagnant because of software issues, but hopefully this works and hopefully it gets out there. So yeah, until next time, goodbye.